In our tour of human history, we have so far been concentrating entirely on the world region in purple on the map on your screen at the moment, Afro-Eurasia, Europe, Africa, and Asian continents. The reason for that, as I think should be obvious by looking at the map, is that these continents were interconnected in a way that the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Island societies were not. So today we're going to take a hard turn and just have a look at societies that developed in the Americas. The story is similar. People there developed, all of the hallmarks of civilization independently. They developed government and religion and hierarchy and economic systems and trade networks, art, record keeping, infrastructure. Some of them developed farming, others remained nomadic, as was the case in Afro-Eurasia. We tend not to think about them on the same terms, however, because our view of the history of the American peoples is through the eyes of the conquerors who came from Europe and colonized, subjugated, killed a bunch of them, and thought of them as barbarians too while they're at it. So we're going to do this part of the story in a day, which is already, historically unfair. We're also doing this under really weird circumstances. I'm recording this the day after there was a fascist right-wing attempted coup at the halls of Congress. And so it's just, teaching in 2020 is awkward. I'm sure learning in 2020 is just as awkward. And I'd like to reserve actually most of our class for your questions for what's going on in the news, because social studies concepts can help explain a lot of that. So, awkward shift from the narrative that we've been talking about to cover really complex, fascinating, wonderful civilizations. It is, almost criminal that we only have a day to cover them. Kind of weird that we spent all this time on Europe, right? But it is what it is. So with that said, we're going to get to it. As a reminder, when we talk about civilizations, we're talking about societies with cities, farming, food surplus, specialization, hierarchy, art and culture, complex government, organized religion, record keeping, so like some system of writing, and infrastructure. And by that standard, civilization absolutely existed on the American continent throughout the entire time period we've been studying. The American continents are really big, right? So civilizations in different parts were very different from each other. Some of them developed urban life, similar to the big empires we've been studying. Some of them developed non-urban, so non-city-based agricultural life, and others continued a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Because of the madness of current events, today's lesson is going to be very different than normal because it's been overwhelming to watch the news for me as well, and it completely limited my ability to prepare a really great video. But I'm not going to sacrifice quality for you. What we're going to do is you guys are going to write down the key points, and then I'm going to read for you a chapter from one of my favorite books on world history that covers this history much better than I can at the present moment anyway. One thing to note, actually two things to note, two of the most important parts of the story. The reason that history in the Americas is so different from trends we've been studying is largely because of that physical separation. There were giant oceans that at this point in history people couldn't cross. So societies in America developed without knowledge or awareness of societies in Europe and Africa and Asia even existing. And similarly, people in Europe and Africa and Asia had no idea that there were whole continents over here with people living in them. The second important part of the story has to do with evaluating the quality of the civilization in the Americas. It's really easy to see European conquests of the Americas, which are coming up next in history, as proof that Europeans were somehow superior to the people who were living in the Americas, the natives, if you want to call them that. This is false and frankly like a pretty racist notion that tends to get perpetuated in history books. So have a look at that list of things that civilizations have, right? In the Americas, they had all of these things, but there are a couple of critical technologies that Afro-Eurasia had developed that had not developed in the Americas. Two of them relate to weapons. Steel is a really, really hard metal, very useful for slicing into people with swords. Did not exist in the Americas. Gunpowder, incredibly destructive, a pretty big advantage if you have it, did not exist in the Americas. In the Americas, there were domesticated animals. They had like llamas and stuff, but they didn't have horses, for example. Pigs, cows, those were not present in the Americas at the time. That's another huge advantage to Europeans. And then finally, this is not a technology, but Afro-Eurasia, partly because it had been coexisting with these domesticated animals for so long, had developed immunities to a number of diseases that were just never introduced into the Americas. So when they came in the ships with Europeans and their animals, they had devastating consequences for the natives. So that's my preface. And with that said, everything on the slide should be fairly obvious. This is what you do need to know for assessments and, things that don't really feel very important to me in this moment in history, but we have to keep going, don't we? So what I'd ask you to do is pause the video, take notes, but then press play again, because I'm going to read you part of a really, really great history book that will explain all of this and give it color and detail. So I'm assuming that you have paused and read the key points and taken notes. And so here are a couple of recommendations and the book that I'm going to be using. If you're interested in the history of the Americas, there are two books that I recommend more than any other. The first is a book called Aztecs by Inca Conquest. It would be kind of hard for you guys to really access in 9th grade, but give it a couple years, and if this is a kind of history that you're interested in, I highly recommend going back to this. Second, the book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, is fantastic in the description and the dignity with which these native cultures are treated by the author Charles C. Mann. I'm going to read to you from a book that I love called The Human Story, Our History from the Stone Age to Today by James C. Davis. And I love this book because it does a lot of the explaining. It doesn't just tell you what things are like, but it gives you some idea as to why. And so this is just going to be kind of awkward because I've never just read a book for a class, but here we go. Right. We're going to start by jumping thousands of years back to explain why there were people in the Americas to begin with. Okay. And so, starting to read now. By 50,000 years ago, we had spread through Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now we would spread into 3 other continents where no humans had set foot. Our subspecies moved to North and South America. Prehistorians of today disagree about who made this move and how and when. The long-accepted story of the settlement of North America went like this. Humans lived in the extreme northeastern tip of Siberia at the Arctic Circle, which reaches far to the east. Today, 53 miles of rough and icy water separate this tip of Asia from North America, but at the time in question, the seas were low, so a wide land bridge of tundra and marshes connected Asia and North America. Bands of Siberian hunters moved back and forth along this land bridge, from continent to continent, but they didn't know that. They were following mammoths and wild horses. Then some of them, from this point on we will refer to them as Indians, wandered away from the eastern, North American end of the land bridge. From there, the Indians probably followed game, so like animals to hunt, from the south and east. Since this was during one of Earth's colder periods, glaciers covered 2/3 of North America, but these pioneers could have walked south along the ice-free Alaskan coast, or they could have trod a narrow ice-free corridor that we know led south between the glaciers.
As they trudged along this corridor, mile-high walls of ice would have flanked them on both sides. When at last they were south of the ice, they would have found themselves in the northwest of what is now the United States. That is the old story of the arrival of humans in the Americas. The newer variations on it are so many that we can only briefly list them. The Indians may have come at different times. They may have come from South Asia, Japan, maybe even Australia. And they may have come by water, not by land, perhaps hugging the shore all the way from Asia, along the Bering Land Bridge and down the western coasts of the Americas. After scattering through North America, the Indians made their way to the other continent that lies to the south. We don't know when, but after decades, maybe centuries, maybe even thousands of years, they wandered down the isthmus between the continents, and then on through the jungles, mountains, and grasslands, all the way to the windy tip of Southern America. Now I have to skip ahead a couple chapters because then he goes through the history of the world, right? So here we go. All right, in chapter 1, which I just read, we guessed at how the New World Indians' tale began. A handful of Siberians, we said, bearing spears and berry baskets, maybe wandered east on the tundra plain that then, like a bridge, linked Asia and North America. By the end of the land bridge, they found themselves in a continent they had never known of. In the centuries that followed, those Indians' descendants scattered through the land and the continent below it. In the meantime, glaciers melted, oceans rose, and stormy water cut off North America again. As a result, the Indians were isolated from everybody else on Earth. Oceans separated the Indians from the Old World for at least 10,000 years. During those millennia, as we have seen, Europeans, Asians, and Africans had learned to raise crops and animals, live in towns and cities, build, write, use metals, make calendars. Meanwhile, just like them, the Indians of the Americas also learned to farm, settled down, and began to live in cities. What is puzzling is that, having had no contact with the Old World, they made these changes only some 3,000 years later than the Old World people did. Seen against the 100,000 or 200,000 years that modern humans have been on the Earth, 3,000 years aren't a lot. We simply don't know why farming began in the New World so soon after it had begun in the Old World. Did the climate of the world suddenly get harsher everywhere at the same time, forcing everyone to quickly find out how to grow food instead of gathering it? Prehistorians have found no proof of this. Did an Old World farmer sail to the New World and teach the Indians how to raise crops and tend cows? Unlikely. Perhaps the discoveries of farming, and then of civilization, were just an astounding coincidence. If we don't know why farming began in the Americas when it did, we do know where. It happened in a concentrated region. Think of the two Americas together as an hourglass, broad at the top, broad at the bottom, but narrow in the middle. The area of rapid change was in or just above, or just below that narrow middle, where the two great masses joined in what today are Mexico, Central America, and a portion of Peru. The Indians' biggest find was how to grow a crop of corn, or maize, which they transformed from humble weed into benefactor of humankind. Prehistorians digging in ancient Indian shelters have found remains of husks and kernels that illustrate how corn developed. Before long, the Indians were also raising other noble plants that the rest of the world had never tasted: potatoes, sweet potatoes, peanuts, cocoa, avocados, tomatoes, chili pepper, squash, and string and lima beans. They also raised two not-so-stable noble ones: tobacco and the shrubs that yield cocaine. After they began to farm, the peasants in the middle region, where the continents joined, had more to eat, and their number rose. They settled down in villages, cleared the land around them, drained the swamps. Some of the villages grew into towns and cities, and they organized as city-states, with all the things we cannot do without: politicians, soldiers, priests, and tax collectors. Striking proof of how these cities thrived are the remnants of Teotihuacan. Oh man, my mother's going to kill me. Teotihuacan, which stood not far from where Mexico City sprawls today. I'm from Mexico City. I should be able to pronounce that, and I failed. Oh my God, so embarrassing. Okay, back to the book. While the Roman Empire flourished, but many of the world's great cities weren't yet born, 150,000 people lived here. They built 2 temple pyramids so huge that later migrants to this place supposed that gods or giants had made them. Of all the ancient peoples, the most accomplished were the Mayas, and yet they flourished in an uninviting place. The northern half of the narrow isthmus that connects the 2 Americas was and is a tangled jungle, hot and damp, full of things that bite. But here it was that the Mayas, when they first began to form, settled down. At first they lived in villages, but in time their numbers rose, and many a dusty village became a handsome city. Each of these was built around a square, flanked by palaces and temples. On one side of the square, the Mayas usually had a court, where they played their popular ball game, and grandstands for the spectators. On another side, a step pyramid would rise, crowned by temples that towered over the nearby jungle. Many Mayans lived quite well. We know about the living standard of one Mayan village because of a recent scientific dig on a site below a volcano in what is now El Salvador. This was a village of 300 Mayas, or near Mayas, differing a bit in speech. One day, 1,500 years ago, disaster struck. This happened during summer, as we know because the fruit on the nearby trees was ripe. It was late afternoon, and the farmers had returned from working in the fields. Some had just begun to eat, dipping fingers in their bowls of cornmeal mush and cherries, and drinking cocoa. Others had already eaten. But as yet they hadn't washed their bowls or taken out their sleeping mats. Then they heard a roar like thunder, and they knew that the volcano was exploding. They fled and saved their lives, but they lost their village, which was buried under 16 feet of ash. As they dug away the ash, archaeologists later, discovered that these Mayan farmers had not only thatch-roofed houses of their own, but a chapel, a village hall, and a storehouse, a shop for making knives and tools, and a sauna. They wove the cotton they raised into cloth, and made their clothes, and lived on vegetables and fruit, shellfish, turkey, deer, and, dogs. Why? The food they didn't need, that doubtless carried to Copan, a Mayan town some 60 miles away, and bartered for volcanic glass to make their knives, and finely painted pot. In one of the humbler houses in the village, archaeologists found over 70 of these handsome pots. These ordinary peasants fared better than most peasants of their time in Europe and Asia, and better than the peasants of El Salvador today. The Mayas flourished from about AD 250, when Rome ruled one end of Eurasia and China, under the Han Dynasty, ruled the other, till near the end of Europe's Dark Ages. Until recently, all we knew of the Mayan history came from the buildings, paintings, pots, and carvings found in vine-clad ruins in the jungles. But experts now can read the Mayas' glyphs, their picture writing, the picture words they carved on the buildings. This much is clear. The Mayas didn't have just one united kingdom. On the contrary, they lived in about 40 towns and cities. As in ancient Greece, a Mayan kinglet often ruled a single town and the villages around it. Many rulers had engaging names, such as Curl Nose, Animal Skull, Lady Six Sky, and Smoking Squirrel. I like that last one. And they often fought each other. In Bonampak, a Mayan city-state in what is today Mexico, dramatic murals tell what happened when the ruling family had a child. In one, the ruler holds the baby up before the nobles. Trumpets blare, dancers listen for the beat of the drums, and revelers prepare to feast on crayfish, carp, and corn. In another, women of the royal family prick their tongues and let their blood drip down on bits of paper, which will then be burned and offered to the gods. In a battle scene, the king, with a bleeding enemy's head suspended from his neck, wages war against his neighbors. The hard-eyed ruler and his warriors seize the captives by the hair and slaughter them to please the gods and thank them for the air. 1,000 years ago, Mayan towns and cities fell apart. Long periods of drought may have ruined them. The stuff of civilization, cities, law courts, rituals, businesses, ball games, paintings, all vanished. In many places, squatters occupied the building for a while, but then the jungle slithered in and hid the palaces and temples. Everything was gone, except the Mayan folk themselves, who were still farming in the villages. Only recently have archaeologists pushed away the vines and found the ruins, and tourists come to view them. A tourist who beheld the Mayan ruins at Chiapas, Mexico, asked her guide, a local man, "Where did all the people go?" She was talking to a Maya. The guide later told another visitor, "We're still here. We never left." When Europeans reached the New World, as they called it, after 1492, the Mayan cities and some other ancient cultures had expired, but others had risen in their place. No one knows how many Indians there were. Different experts have guessed the total number in the two Americas at anywhere from 40 to 100 million. At the time, Europe's population would have been roughly 80 million. Among the newly civilized Indians were the able, brutal Aztecs. They had earlier left their homes in northern Mexico, perhaps because they grew too numerous to survive there. They turned into nomads, dressed in shirts and loincloths made of palm leaf fiber and sandals made of plaited straw. And they wandered around south to the Valley of Mexico. Despite its name, the valley, quote unquote, is a high plateau encircled by volcanoes. Until 500 years ago, the land was mostly forests, lakes, and swampy plains. The Aztecs couldn't find a place to live because several city-states already held the fertile land around the lakes. So they squatted in several places near the lakes until the rightful owners drove them out. Not only did the owners want to keep their land, they also were repelled by the Aztecs' brutality, about which many tales survive. According to one story, the ruler of the embarrassing for me, people made the very big mistake of granting the Aztecs his daughter as a wife for their chief. When the ruler came to the wedding, he discovered that the Aztecs had honored him by sacrificing his daughter to the gods. An Aztec priest was wearing her skin. Understandably, the Culhua drove away the Aztecs. They resumed their wandering till they reached two vacant, swampy islands off the southwest shore of Lake Texcoco. My mom's going to kill me. Texcoco. In this seemingly hopeless sight, these able people settled down and built a city. They named it Tenochtitlan, I knew this one. Tenochtitlan. Beside the prickly pear cactus is what that means. Tenochtitlan. They built giant causeways to link the islands to the mainland, and they dug canals across the island that would serve as streets for their canoes. From the bottom of the lake, they scooped the soil and shoved it on rafts and man-made islands where they grew their crops. They built houses, palaces, temples, and an aqueduct to bring them drinkable water from the hills. Before long, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world. When the Aztecs settled on their islands, nearby kings were always making war with one another. This belligerence, fighting nature, that means, proved helpful to the hungry new arrivals. At first, they fought as mercenaries for their neighbors. Mercenaries are like soldiers that you hire to fight for you. But later on, they turned against their bosses, one by one. They fell upon them suddenly, burned their temples, and divided up their prisoners, the booty, and their women. Sometimes they used milder methods. Once they marched to a nearby state and quote-unquote invited the ruler to bring his lords to the capital and adore their god. Hummingbird on the left. Hummingbird on the left is capitalized, like the name of the god. The ruler swore he'd never even let his whores dance before the god. It's in a history book, I can say it, it's not a bad word now. The ruler swore he'd never let his whores dance before the god. But when he saw he had no choice, he groveled in the dirt and pleaded for his life. It wasn't long before the Aztecs held a rich and ample empire. At its peak, It stretched across what is now Mexico from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, and it held perhaps 5 million people. In size and population, it was roughly equal to a Western European country of its time. Every year, the Aztecs forced their subject towns to send them porters bearing gold, and also corn, tomatoes, beans, and squash, turkey, deer, and dogs, and humans they could kill to please their gods. Yeah, human sacrifices. Like many other Indian peoples then, the Aztecs held that they must give their god the food they wanted, human hearts and blood. If they failed to carry out this sacred task, their victories would cease. The sun would die, and life would end. It was partly for this need to feed the gods that the Aztecs always sought new lands to conquer, since these would bring new pools of victims for their knives. They claimed it was an honor to be slaughtered for a god. Every year, they prodded about 15,000 naked prisoners up the steps of their temples. As each captive reached the top, the clerics forced them down onto slabs of stone, split their chests, ripped out their beating hearts, and fed their blood to idols of their gods. Later on, the priests and other dignitaries sometimes made a dinner of a victim. Blood-stained though they were, these former nomads turned into a civilized people. That is, they learned the arts and skills the Maya once had known, and which many peoples of the Old World also knew. True, they never learned the art of smelting metals. They edged their swords with volcanic glass instead. And they didn't know the use of wheels. But they had a government that worked, handsome buildings, painters, poets, astronomers, even historians. By farming with intelligence and squeezing tribute from the folk they ruled, the Aztecs lived quite well. Or at least their noble families did, richly housed, brightly clad in cotton cloth and feathers, fed on dogs and chocolate, and certain of an afterlife of gemstones, clouds, or many-colored birds. And yet, the Aztecs tore the hearts from living humans. Can we argue that, in the Aztecs' case, human sacrifices were themselves a proof of their attainments? Something other Indians also did. The new rich Aztecs did much more, as if to prove how well they'd learned what was expected of a people who were civilized. It was while the Aztecs were at their peak, conquering and sacrificing others, that Columbus reached the New World's eastern edge. After he'd sailed home to report his findings, others got on ships and journeyed to the newfound lands. Many of these men were Spaniards who had fought the Europeans' wars. They were restless seekers of adventure, ravenous for treasure, land, and humans they could rule over. Among them was Hernán Cortés, whose most daring deed until he sailed from Spain had been his nearly fatal leap from a balcony when his lover's husband came home early. In the New World, young Cortés took part in the Spanish conquest of Cuba. His reward was land and Indian slaves. He was clever, brave, sometimes decent, often cruel, and greedy. In 1519, Cuba's Spanish governor chose Cortés to lead an expedition to the Central American mainland. He gathered ships and troops and sailed to the eastern coast of Mexico, where the Aztecs' lands began. His forces were 508 soldiers, about 100 sailors, 16 horses, several little cannons, and 13 muskets. When they reached the mainland, Cortés burned the little ships. Without the ships, there could be no return to Cuba, so his soldiers hadn't any choice but to conquer or be killed. From the steaming jungles near the shore, Cortés led his army up and through the rugged hills, toward Tenochtitlan. Many Indians on their way abhorred the Aztecs. Abhorred means like strongly hated, right? Because the Aztecs had been busy conquering them. So they joined the Spaniards, fed them, hauled their guns, and fought beside them. Other Indians tried to drive them back, but the Spaniards had an edge, the skills and weapons they'd acquired in European wars. Whether the Indians charged in yelling mobs, Spaniards fought in ordered ranks. Whereas Indians fought with lances, swords of hard volcanic glass, and bows and arrows, Spaniards fought with horses, crossbows, pikes, and swords of steel. They had weapons that not only killed, but terrified the Indians. Sticks that barked and killed, logs that roared and killed by the scores, and worst of all, terrifying beasts that had 2 heads and many legs. What's more, The Spaniards had the will to win. They never doubted that they fought for their God against Satanists, sadists, and sodomites, Aztec priests in parenthetical, or that the Aztec ruler's treasures might as well be theirs and his. When they reached Tenochtitlan, Cortés so charmed the Aztec ruler Moctezuma that he invited the Spaniards to stay there as his guests. Then they took him prisoner and divvied up his gold and silver, pearls and jewels. They invited themselves to a festival, and when the drums were beating and chanting reached its peak, and 600 Aztec nobles were dancing, the Spaniards struck. They lopped the drummers' hands and head off, and then they killed the noblemen and stripped their bodies of their gold. However, when the Spaniards, pious Christians, started to destroy the temples, the outraged Aztecs rose against them. A bloody battle followed, in the course of which the Aztecs wounded their submissive king with rocks and arrows. Moctezuma died soon after, hastened on his way perhaps by Spanish knives. To escape, the Spaniards fought their way along the causeway from the islands to the mainland, losing a third of their number. But nothing would deter the Spaniards who, remember, had no ships in which to sail home. 2 weeks after they had fled Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards crushed an Aztec army. Then Cortés collected reinforcements, built some boats for island fighting, and began the battle for Tenochtitlan. By now, the Spaniards had some silent allies fighting by their side, more destructive than their guns. In their bodies, they had brought from Europe germs of smallpox, measles, and dysentery. These are diseases. Even for the Europeans, these diseases could be deadly. How much more lethal were they for the Indians, so isolated from the Old World and its epidemics? Unlike the Spaniards, they had no immunity at all to Old World microbes, and their bodies served as splendid hosts. Smallpox, whose virus one could easily spread simply by breathing, was the worst. At the start of 1519, it had swept through Hispaniola Island, killing most of the Indians. It had reached the mainland shortly after Cortés, by no coincidence, of course, and raged across the Aztec Empire, often killing half to all the people in a town. And now, while the Spaniards struck Tenochtitlan, smallpox also hit the city. It largely spared the Spaniards, who were probably more immune, but it wiped out nearly half of the city's defenders. As the Spaniards and their Indian allies took the city street by street, they razed it house by house and dumped the rubble in the canals. They raped the women, killed the Indians by the hundreds of thousands, and probed their bodies searching for the hidden gold. When they stopped, the earth was drenched with gore and strewn with maggot-covered limbs and bodies. The stench was so atrocious that the gagging visitors moved outside the ruined city to a place along the shore. At just this moment, wine from Spain arrived, and pigs from Cuba, and the Spaniards held a victory party. Next day, they climbed a hill that overlooked the lake. A priest conducted mass, and they gazed down on the wound they'd made when they'd ripped out the Aztec's heart. Back when the Aztecs had won their empire in the north, the Incas to the south had built their equally ill-fated one. The Incas' heartland was perched high up in the Andes Mountains on the western side of South America. The Incas left no written records, so we know their story chiefly from the tales of their memorizers or tradition tellers that had passed them on. Before they started on their conquests, the Incas had been much like other Andes people. But under 2 extraordinary kings, they overwhelmed their nearest neighbors. Then they conquered farther tribes and stationed troops among them. They added conquered soldiers to their army. Soon the Incas held almost all of the Andes Mountains and the western coastal desert. Their empire stretched 2,500 miles from the equator down to what is now south-central Chile. They ruled perhaps as few as 6 or as many as 12 million people. These included llama herders, high up in the mountains, where the air was thin and visitors could only gasp for breath, potato farmers in the valleys, naked hunters in the jungles, whom the Incas rarely glimpsed, and fishermen in the towns along the coastal desert. The Incas broke no protests, and they wanted no revolts. They often broke up tribes they conquered, forcing many of these tribesmen to settle elsewhere, far from home. Then they brought in loyal Indians to take the places of the tribes they'd moved. But what a contrast with the Aztecs. The Incas could be harsh, but they were also decent, or at least prudent, and they wanted all their subjects clothed and fed. They required the have areas in their empire, which produced ample potatoes and llama wool, to send their surpluses, even herds of llamas, to the have not areas. They resettled many Indians from the highlands in the valleys so that they could grow sufficient corn and cocoa. Oh, sorry, not cocoa, coca, as in cocaine, a beloved drug, for the people of the lands they came from. In ways like these, the Incas built a stable state, turned their former enemies into loyal subjects, and made them prosper. The Incas knew what the Persians and the Romans had known before them, that an empire must have first-rate communications, so they built no fewer than 19,000 miles of road, linking the provinces to Cusco, their capital. Incan roads ran through the swamps and deserts, up sheerest cliffs, through tunnels in the mountains, and over bridges made of interwoven vines that the Incas slung along the deepest gorges. Over these roads and bridges, relays of messengers ran 150 miles a day, bringing messages they memorized. All right, and that will do it for today.